Much of Western art that we look at today and much of our concepts regarding beauty stem from from Greek sources in many cases. The ancient Greeks are really an important primary source for Western culture and civilization in a lot of respects. We have a tendency to look back at the ancient Greeks when we talk about democracy, when we talk about some of the earliest forms of humanism and rationalism, and some of our greatest aesthetic concepts when it comes to art. And this isn't without good reason. The Greeks really were incredibly sophisticated in many respects. Now, they also certainly owe a tremendous debt to the art of the Egyptians and also the Near East. And we'll be looking at and exploring some of those connections when we talk about early Greek art in particular. But a little bit of background first as we begin here. Where we left off last time, we had been talking about the art of the ancient Aegean. And we, of course, talked about the ancient Minoans, we talked about the Mycenaeans. And as we know, these civilizations failed. And these civilizations fell, and when they did so, they really left a vacuum in the region. Greece fell into a dark ages, really. During this period in history, the Greek people forgot how to build out of monumental stone. We also see the loss of other skills and techniques and processes like fresco painting and a variety of other sophisticated things that had prior to this been part of their artistic heritage and really part of their skill set. Pottery continues, but many of the other forms of artistic production that we're used to seeing vanish. So what ends up happening, though, is about the 8th century BC, we see things begin to shift back the other direction. One of the things that occurs during this period, of course, is the famous founding of the first Olympiad. And this moment, this founding of the Olympics, the first Olympics in Greece, are often looked back at by the Greeks as being this seminal point in the foundation of who the Greeks became and who they were. The Greeks considered themselves, all of the people who spoke Greek, really, to be part of this body, as opposed to the barbarians on the outside who didn't. That said, ancient Greece was not a unified political structure by any means. It was a series of independent polis, or city-states. And these independent city-states often found themselves at odds with each other and oftentimes found themselves engaged in bloody conflict with each other, such as we see between Sparta and Athens. But when we talk about ancient Greece, about early ancient Greece in particular, we'll be looking at some examples of artwork from this period that show us the development of early bronze casting in the region and pottery as well. And of course, eventually we're moving on to some early examples of architecture. So a little bit more about some general Greek context here. In terms of geography, when we talk about ancient Greece, one of the things that works out in their favor is we do have this kind of isolation of these individual Greek city-states along the coastline and on islands. And this results in some greater extent of self-reliance and emphasis on the individual really develops here as well. By the way, a little bit more about geography. A lot of people often tend to assume that we talk about orders of Greek architecture. For example, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. People often tend to think of these as being chronological, whereas in fact they are geographic. The Dorians were a group of people who migrated from the north and essentially displaced the descendants, really, of the Mycenaeans, and probably actually interbred with these people as well. But this is really a distinct cultural group. It's also quite possible that they displaced another group of people, pushed them out, and these people ended up migrating to Asia Minor, and these people are known as the Ionians. Now, there's some discussion about whether the Ionians were displaced from mainland Greece, or if they were, in fact, people who were native to that part of what today would be Turkey, or some combination thereof. But these are two distinct cultural groups, two distinct ethnicities, really, if you will, within the ancient Greek group of people that we'll be looking at and discussing. Now, when it comes to religion, it's often said that the ancient Greeks made their humans into gods and their gods into humans. And this is really kind of apt. One of the things that we see that's interesting when we talk about the ancient Greeks, about Greek gods and goddesses, is that the real difference between the ancient Greek people and their gods was that the gods were immortal. But beyond this, they were as human as anyone else, in that they suffered jealousy and they made foolish decisions and all sorts of things. And so we often see these rather interesting tales and stories about the Greek gods. And of course, on the opposite end, we see sometimes these Greek people, these heroes, rendered as these tremendous godlike creatures. We talk about some of the Greek heroes from the tragedies and other stories, and of course some of the feats and activities that they complete are really quite astonishing. But the Greeks have an interesting kind of point of view here, really. See, the Greeks see their gods really as being idealized people, at least in a physical sense. And so one of the things that the Greeks do that's kind of interesting is that the ancient Greeks believe that this pursuit of physical fitness and also mental fitness, really a sound mind in a sound body, would allow an individual to pursue, to some extent, this track towards deification. The idea that you can get pretty close to being a god through this perfection of body and mind. And so this concept of athleticism and intellectualism, for the Greeks, it was the way in which they could most closely emulate the gods. And this is an important concept, really, when we talk about the ancient Greeks. Another important idea is the concept of humanism. So humanism is really this idea that an individual has worth, really. It's about the relationship of the individual to the world around them. And it places this emphasis on the capabilities, on the potential of one individual, of a single person. And this is something we don't see in a lot of other cultures. And so it's this kind of introspective culture of ideas as well as action, and it allows for some really interesting developments philosophically and also, of course, artistically. Now, another one of these ideas, another one of these concepts is the concept of idealism. And we can see some illustrations of this in Greek philosophy as well, particularly if we look at Plato. Plato wrote about this cave allegory, and some of you may be familiar with that. But the cave allegory gets really at the nature of reality, about what is truth, what is the real essence of existence. And the Greeks really believed, and Plato at any rate believed, that the world of visible forms around us, the things that you could see and touch and feel every day, were really just a reflection, a shadowy image flickering on the wall of real truth. Now, some Greek philosophers, like Aristotle, for example, believe differently. But we do see this concept of idealism as becoming a very important concept when we talk about art. We talk about the development of Greek aesthetic in sculpture in particular. Another concept is rationalism, and this we see illustrated very clearly in, for example, architecture. The idea that the intellect is the highest human faculty, that the universe is founded on rational ideas and principles. All things are numbers. And we see this sense of mathematics, the importance of things like algebraic equations, reflected in constructions like the Parthenon. Math is everything. We talk about Greek architecture. We talk about Greek proportions for the human figure. These ideas of harmonious ratios and principles are an incredibly important concept and a very important thing to understand when we're talking about Greek art. Another aspect of this can be seen in the belief really that through knowledge, through investigation, one could understand, unlock the logic of the universe, this idea that everything around us is rational and comprehensible if you just have the ability to look carefully, to investigate, to understand. And so this sense of investigation and this sense of scientific research really is again a hallmark of Greek culture and also something that we see in Greek art. So in the map that we're looking at here of Greece, we can see some of these key cities that we'll be talking about. The most important of these, without a doubt, of course, is going to be for us Athens. Artistically speaking, Athens is really where it's all at for us. But there are some other sites that are also important. Historically speaking, of course, Sparta in the south is quite central. And you can also see Marathon up there. Marathon, of course, the site of the famous battle with the Persians. So we'll be talking a little bit about some of these different locations. We'll also talk a little bit about some other cities as well. But really central to our discussion will, of course, be the city of Athens. So our investigation of Greek art is going to be roughly chronological. We'll bounce around a little bit. For the most part, we're going to be starting in about the 9th century or 900s really BCE and working our way forward from there. But Greek art is typically broken down chronologically into a series of periods. So the earliest of these periods that we talk about is the geometric period. And this is characterized by geometric stylization within sculpture and also within painting. From there, we'll be moving on to the Orientalizing period, the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. These can also be subdivided and talked about in some more specific terms when we break them down and look at them more closely. Within each of these different periods, we'll be looking at examples of sculpture, of architecture, and painting, and discussing how they really relate to the period. The first area we're going to be really investigating here, of course, is the Greek geometric period, and we'll be looking at sculpture. So one of the things that we tend to see is we see highly schematic objects. So again, a schematic is a standardized approximation. So the figures that we see here are not particularly realistic, but they're conceptual. They're intended to represent the concept, the idea of a given individual or figure. They also tend to be really quite small in scale. The first of these that we're going to look at in this image here is actually an image of a very famous Greek hero. And it's sometimes referred to just simply as the hero and centaur, but this more than likely represents the famous pair of Heracles and Nessos, which was a famous battle where, of course, the famous Heracles does, has this fight with this composite creature, part man and part horse. It's not large; it's only about 4.5 inches in height. But this is another one of these examples of a schematic bronze cast figure from this period in history. And these are quite rare. There aren't really very many of these that still survive. But composite creatures like this, like the centaur, are quite popular, though. And we see these in, throughout this region, throughout even earlier periods in history. We see sphinxes in Egypt, we see Lamassu in the Near East, and so these type of creatures were considered to be really quite powerful. But of course, this is again a demonstration of the power of the hero here, in this case more than likely Heracles. Some of you may know this hero as Hercules, by the way, which is in fact the Roman name for the same demigod. But according to the Greeks, he was Heracles. But in this case, we see this kind of awkward-looking centaur with an odd set of proportions. You can see that his front legs are actually human, within this stem coming off of there, and the rear legs of a horse. And the hero here, again, quite possibly Heracles, is depicted as being much larger, showing his victorious status. The next image here is another small cast bronze, only about 8 inches in height, and it is known as the Manticlos Apollo. So this is an object that gets its name from a surviving inscription on the object itself. Inscribed onto it, on the side of this object, it says, "Manticlos dedicated me as a tithe to the far-shooting lord of the silver bow. You, Phoebos, might give some pleasing favor in return." So this is an offering to a god. Phoebos is another name, by the way, for Apollo. It essentially means the radiant one, but that's who it refers to. So we don't know if this particular object is intended to represent Apollo or Manticlos or possibly neither of them. It at one point in time had eyes that were inlaid, more than likely had a helmet as well, but we see these very stylized, very geometric forms. And this is typical and characteristic of, again, the geometric period, most appropriately. You have this elongated neck, and again, it's highly schematic rather than accurately representational of the human form. So next, let's take a moment and look at an example of Greek geometric painting. Now, painting in this early period in Greek history is again also quite schematic. We also see what are known as meander patterns, and these are still popular today. We still see these sometimes in home decor or other things, but the most popular of these really is this kind of meandering Greek key pattern, which we'll see here. Similar to some other earlier examples, figures here are restricted to a register, to horizontal registers. It isn't until we get a little farther along here during the Orientalizing period that we see figures begin to break out of those boundaries. So the object we're looking at here is really a very large ceramic vessel. It's about 3 foot 4.5 inches in height, and it's a geometric crater. Now, a crater is a type of ceramic vessel which traditionally is used for mixing water and wine, but this one's a little bit different. It is in fact funerary in function. This was found in a graveyard, cemetery at Dipylon in Athens. And this particular object appears to have been essentially serving the function of a tombstone. And we actually have images painted on the surface here which depict a burial scene. We have a deceased man on a funerary couch with the shrouds suspended above. This is not an attempt, by the way, to depict realistic space. We don't see that shown. The images are very flattened. You can see the chariots, for example. Both wheels are shown simultaneously. The image is very stylized and, again, typical of the geometric period. In the burial scene, again, we have these very flattened surfaces, and this tells us a little bit, really, in the way things are represented here, with the mourners and the whole scene in general. The Greek idea of death, there really is no reference here to the afterlife. What we have here is really this testament that was intended to really simply state, here lies a worthy man. One of the things that's quite striking when we look at the ancient Greeks compared to some other cultures, the ancient Greeks built, for example, their temples in stone. But we have very few surviving examples of Greek tombs. We look at the Egyptian world and we see the opposite. There are some temples like that at Karnak and Luxor that survive in good condition, but more often than not, when we're talking about important, permanent, serious Egyptian architecture, we're talking about tombs. And so it's an interesting contrast that we see when we look at the two cultures. By the way, this particular object, this geometric crater, is actually hollow. It's open all the way through the bottom. So this could have served simply as a drain for rainwater. It also quite possibly was intended to serve as a way to pour libations or wine down into the grave and to basically present this as an offering to the deceased.